Hi folks, it's Mike at Airnetics. In this video we will run through the relay monitor window, which is a way of controlling and monitoring each remote independently. So to open the window, you either double click on the unit or highlight the unit and hit open monitor window. And you'll see a relay monitor window for ramp number 1 has come up. And this gives us all of the details about this particular unit, its application firmware version, boot firmware version, internal temperature, GUID, which you mentioned earlier. It's like a MAC address. And there are several different controls that will run through each one of them here independently. But just a quick overview. This shows the network ID that was assigned. This is his friendly name, a name that you have given it or can change in the database. For example, we'll change that slightly and hit register node, and now it becomes 1A. You can reset the parameters of the unit. If there's something that looks odd or something going wrong with the unit, you bring it up and just hit reset parameters, and it will put everything back to the factory settings. So do that again if things don't look quite right to you. This button is an interesting thing. If you've put the unit up in the field and it's up and operating and you're trying to identify which unit is which, you hit the locate button and it will put out a 3-second tone that's pretty loud that will allow you to figure out which one it is and give it the name. So this is a post-installation way of identifying which unit is which once they're up and on the pole. The pole list is not used, so you can just disregard that. In this section, this is the transmit receive channel select mode. So in automatic, and you can switch between these just by clicking the button. In automatic, it will pick up the first largest signal that it sees. So if you're picking up the fixed master someplace and its signal is bigger than any others, like other repeaters, this unit will pick the fixed master up. Once you have picked a channel to use, I recommend going back over to fixed to manual, and that way it will always listen for channels 1 and 6. So if you're in auto mode, you can actually hit manual rescan, and this will force the unit to drop offline. You'll see over here he's missing poles, gone away. Now he's come back, so he's rescanned for the strongest signal that he can find, and that only works in automatic mode. So once you found that strong signal, put him back over in manual, and he will always listen for channels 1 and 6. Now let me show you an example of what will happen if you're not transmitting on 1 and 6. Again, we're watching the missed poles in the master map screen, and this guy is no longer connected because he's listening for channel 1 and 6. We're actually transmitting on 2 from the master. So we go back down to 1. He'll reacquire. We can double click this time on him to open it up, and we see that he's listening only on 1 and 6. So that's kind of how you do, searching for channels. If you want it to be on a certain repeater channel, you can basically force him over to that channel by changing channels, hitting auto, let him reacquire it, and then once he's acquired, hit manual to lock him down there. In this section, this is the transmit section, so any remote ramp can be a repeater by turning on its transmit channels, and the way you want to do that is set it to a channel that's not being used. So we'll go to 2 and 7, and you can only do that if you're in manual mode. If you're in automatic, you can't change the channels, so they're not lit up. So we'll enable his transmit channel. And it takes a second for the command to go out and come back. So now he's transmitting on channels 2 and 7. So he is a repeater. So anybody further down the line that's listening for channels 2 and 7 or is in automatic mode will pick this guy up as a repeater. And transmit diversity, just leave that on all the time. What that means is if you're not using both channels, transmit diversity turns one of them off. Highly recommend leaving them both on, just because it improves the probability of a good signal at that next remote. So down in this lower left is the audio section, and the gauges you see, the audio level here, and that'll be a bouncing green bar when there's audio coming out of this remote unit. And then the volume setting, you can reduce it by 10 dB, and you can actually increase it by up to 20. And you can hear that in the background as noise. So that's an independent volume control, and that will stick. Once you set the volume at the remote site, it stays that way until you change it again manually. Delay is a way of introducing up to 500 milliseconds of delay in any one link, so that you can time align the output of these things for a live performance, for example. That's a little beyond the scope of this introductory training course. We'll go through that a bit later in a more detailed configuration setting. The audio output can be independently manually muted. Now this implies that the scheduler is not on, overriding your manual mute, but if the scheduler is not on at the master, you can individually mute each remote with this button. In the standard configuration from the factory, the audio output is a mix of the left and the right channels. So we have a 2-channel stereo system, and each remote can be mixed so that the left and the right come out both speakers. Now if you want to independently have the left channel out of the left speaker and the right out of the right, you put it on 2-channel stereo. And we're finding that if you leave it in 2-channel stereo, the sound is actually a little bit nicer. There's more presence. The mixing them together tends to make the sound a little dull. So you might want to experiment between these two and see what you think. And then if you are trying to use the channels independently, where you have only the left channel coming out both speakers or only the right channel coming out both speakers, that's what these buttons are for. So we're going to leave it in 2-channel stereo. Now this is a button that disables the internal audio amplifier, IAMP. This is really for testing, and just leave that enabled. If you ever see this flashing or red, that means there's something wrong with that amplifier. The PA gain, I would leave at 0. If for some reason you want to set this guy at a lower gain than others, like 10 dB below some other, without using the volume control, you can do it here manually. But in most cases, just leave this PA gain setting at 0 dB of gain, and then again you have independent slider volume control over here of the output volume. Again, this is the output volume at a remote. On the master screen, this is the input volume to the master, and this is the output volume at a remote. So keep that in mind. Again, receive channels, typically we start at the master with 1 and 6. First relay would be 2 and 7, 3 and 8, 4, 9, 5, and 10. And that's your set of 5 channels. So this particular guy's on manual. He's only listening to 1 and 6. And then we have an automatic selection of which antenna has the strongest signal. So in this particular case, the right antenna has a minus 19 dBm signal, which is pretty high, and the left antenna has minus 47. So in this case, that antenna is either blocked by the pole or broken, or in this particular case, it's not installed. And so you can operate with one antenna. Just make sure that second antenna port is covered and not allowing rain to get in it. So if you don't have an antenna on the left-hand side, you can come down here to the transmit receive antenna configuration and say none. That's going to take a second to go out and verify it. Now this antenna has been disabled. There's no signal coming into it. And if it's that far below the other antenna, chances are you don't want to use it anyway if it's blocked, because the radio will try to sample both sides, and if this one is down in the mud, down in the red, when it samples it may drop packets just because that signal's so low. So if it's 10, 15, 20 dB below the other one, just turn it off and don't use it. So again, these are the receive channels. The uplink node ID is the network node ID of the unit that's transmitting this guy, his uplink. So we see that network ID number 1 has been given to this first ramp just because it's the only one on the network. And so 0 in this case is the master. And master will always be node 0. And then this is just an informational thing, the uplink control channel. Just to clarify things, so we have a downlink signal from the uplink unit. So he's sending a downlink signal, and then we have a return or an uplink control channel that sends the data back from this remote, and that's on channel 1. And that will always be on the primary channel that it's receiving as the uplink control channel. Nothing you need to worry about, it's all automatic. And then if you're dropping packets, if the signal is way down in the mud and you're dropping packets, if it's down in the minus 85 or 90 dBm range, you will get a packet error rate. You're dropping the signal coming from the uplink channel. And that will show up here, and it will also show up in the packet error rate graph we'll go through in a minute. So that's something to keep an eye on if you got a low signal. There are ways of configuring things. Now, in the newest version of firmware, we have what's called packet loss concealment. If you're getting an occasional dropout, that's okay. You probably can't hear it just because of the PLC, packet loss concealment. So don't be too concerned that you're getting 1 or 2 blips a second. Use your judgment, go out and listen to it, and decide whether or not it's acceptable because they're very hard to hear, or if you need to do something else like move the antennas around or get an extender or a higher gain antenna. So keep an eye on packet error rate, but most of the time single packet errors, drop packets, will not be audible. Antenna configuration we talked about. I'm not going to go into much detail in this training video because directional antennas are a whole different ballgame, and we do have, starting with version 3 firmware, we do have the ability to add directional upstream and downstream antennas to each remote unit. And that's very beneficial if you got a long haul or some interference or some other issue with signal strength. Using either directional upstream or downstream or both can really help the signal. So we'll go through that in a different video. The other thing, I'm not going to go into the front-end module calibration. Don't use this. It's actually not going to do anything, but it's a verification that things are calibrated properly in the transmitter. We use that for FCC testing. Alarms, if there is a pending alarm with this unit that you've enabled back in the master screen, then that will show up here as a flashing red light, and this alarm number of seconds will count down from 300 to 0. Once it counts down, the alarm in this particular unit will be sent back to the master. So if you see a flashing alarm, that means something's going on, like you've lost audio, your bit error rate or your packet loss is too high. Any one of the different alarm configurations would show up here. This is a way to load firmware, do a firmware upgrade in a remote over the air. This is a new feature in version 3 that we will dedicate an entire training session to, just because it's fairly complex and not something you want to deal with at this point. But it's a way of picking a firmware file to send over the air to the remote to upgrade its firmware. And it can be relayed through multiple hops to get to a remote node. It's very helpful for remotely keeping track of and upgrading units that are already deployed in the field. So that's what that's all about. The 2 monitor windows you see over here are RSSI, Remote Signal Strength Indicator monitor. Again, that correlates right antennas, this guy, so minus 19 or 20 dBm. This guy's minus 47. Again, if we disable the left antenna, it drops to 0. The bottom graph is packet error rate. So we send everything out in packetized digital format. So we send it twice. We send it once on antenna 1 on transmit channel 2, and we send it a second time on antenna 2 on transmit channel 7. That's assuming you have 2 antennas. If you don't have 2 antennas, both of these packets get sent out on the one that's enabled. So in this case, the omnidirectional antenna is getting both transmit channels 2 and 7, burst number 1 and burst number 2. That's a little advanced, but we do have both frequency diversity, spatial diversity with antennas, and time diversity. So there's triple diversity in the transmission, which makes the link much more secure and stable. If you do happen to drop one of the 2 packets, you'll see a green blip, a green spike. And that's fine. It didn't get the first one, but it did get the second one. So you don't have an audio dropout if you just have one green spike, or even a bunch of green spikes. If you get green spikes all the time, that means there is some interference in the area that is blocking one of the 2 channels for whatever reason. And we have that in several different cities where there's a utility company operating at 900 megahertz, and they operate consistently on one of the 2 channels, and we drop that first packet almost all the time. That's not desirable, but it can still work in that condition, and the audio does not drop out. If you miss both the first and the second packet, you'll get a red blip, a red spike. And if you get a bunch of red spikes, you're going to hear the audio dropouts. And if you get consistent red spikes forever, all the time, the system's not really stable, and you're going to get a number of dropouts. So something either needs to be done. You change the location, directional antennas, reconfigured channels, things like that. So that gets a little more complex, and we'll do that in an advanced configuration course. But just keep an eye on the packet error rate, and if things are not going well, get back in touch with us, and we'll help you figure out how to fix that and get rid of the dropouts. So that's a detailed overview of the relay monitor window. Again, you'll have one of these for each unit that's talking to the master, and it's a way of manually or automatically configuring everything from here. One thing we didn't mention is remote spectrum analyzer screen. We're not going to deal with that. We still got some things to work out. It's a way of detecting whether there's remote interference at a remote site, and we got a couple bugs in that we're still working on. So just leave it over here in packet error rate. You'll see those red and green blips I was talking about because we went offline for a second and came back on. So we dropped both the first and second packet. So that is the relay monitor window, and we'll cover more in a different video. Thank you.